Okay, today we're going to talk about the features of God according to classic theism. And classic theism is a view shared by modern Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, known as the Abrahamic faiths, because they all have Abraham as their sort of forebear. And they all essentially believe in the same God. The God of the Old Testament, as it's called in Christianity, or the Pentateuch, as it's called in Judaism. Now, it's not clear that theism always ascribed to the description of God that we're going to talk about. If you read the Old Testament, the God in the Old Testament might fit more closely with what's called henotheism. We think of Christianity and Judaism and Islam in particular as monotheistic religions, one God. But if you read the Old Testament, it sounds like there are sort of competing gods, and Jehovah or Yahweh is one God, the God of the tribe of Israel, amongst possibly others, and you're not supposed to worship the others. So each group of people has their own God, which is why it's not polytheism. Each group of people has one God rather than many gods, which is polytheism, but there is a different God for different groups of people, like the Egyptians have their God and so on. But certainly contemporary Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is committed to this idea that there is one God who meets a certain description. I don't know if you remember, most of you were very small at the time, if you were born, but there was a song in the 90s that went, "What if God were one of us?" And it was a god-awful song. How did it go? What if God was one of us? Just a stranger on the bus trying to find his way home. The worst line was something about trying to call someone on the phone, perhaps the Pope in Rome or something like that. It was really bad. But it always bugged me because if God was one of us, just a stranger on the bus, then he wouldn't be God, for the reason that theism makes clear, because God has to have a certain set of features to meet the description of God. In the book, in the chapter that you read from Stairs and Bernard, it talks about Buffy the Vampire Slayer and how there's this God who shows up and suggests that this person can't be a God. It might be a powerful supernatural being, but can't be God, because God has to have certain features. Well, what are the features that God has to have? Well, there's a lot of omnis in there. Most famously, the three essential perfections are omnipotence, being all-powerful, omniscience, being all-knowing, and omnibenevolence, being all-caring or all-loving. Those three, as we shall see, will crop up again in the next unit's topic, which is the problem of evil, because it turns out there's a puzzle if God is all of those three things. But for now, we'll focus on sort of how we should understand at least two of those. We'll focus on omnipotence and omniscience in this unit. Now, those aren't the only features that God is supposed to have in theism. There are a number of other features, like, for example, omnipresence. God is supposed to be everywhere. And God is supposed to be eternal or everlasting. Everlasting, then there's some dispute amongst theologians and philosophers which ones makes more sense. Eternal has come to refer to the notion that God is outside of time. That is, God is unaffected by time. You can't make claims about God that are tensed or refer to time, like yesterday God did this and tomorrow God will do that. You can't do that according to the view of God as eternal, because God is outside of all time. It's as if God looks down on the entire history of the universe all at once, because God is not in time. And And reasons for having this view, the usual reason is that God is also supposed to be changeless, but if God is in time, then God changes in the sense that God now is later than God before. So there is a different feature of God. God changes if God is in time. So several people, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, have suggested that God must be outside of time. Alternatively, the view that God is everlasting suggests that God is in time. He just has no beginning and will have no end. But just as we are in the present always, and we experience sort of the flow of time, that there is a past, we're sort of ever moving into the future, and the past is getting larger, if you like. The same is true of God. God is in the present along with us. That makes God a lot more easy to understand, because then one of the problems with the view of God as outside of time is there are all kinds of things that only make sense to us in time. So, for example, having a thought is something that has duration. You can begin to have a thought, and then you go on having the thought, and then you stop having the thought, as if it's sort of speech inside your head. And of course, speech has a duration. Whereas if God is outside of time, he certainly can't have thoughts in the same way. So if God is outside of time, then that makes him a lot weirder than we can possibly imagine. He doesn't necessarily have emotions in the same way. We can't talk to him if God is outside of time, because we are trapped in time. He is outside of time. We can't sort of communicate with God. So if we say God is outside of time, that makes him very alien to us. And this has been okay with plenty of philosophers who've argued this. For example, Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest of the modern philosophers, was committed to this view. And we'll see the effect on that when we get to the section on prayer, what implications that has. But certainly it doesn't fit with a lot of people's view of God as sort of a personage that we can communicate with. So there's that. God is supposed to be immaterial, not necessarily a material entity that you can encounter. So there are various features, and all of them are philosophically interesting, but we don't have time to look at them all, so we're going to focus on omnipotence first, and then omniscience. Okay, omnipotence. Omnipotence means being all-powerful. Well, what does that mean? A simple way to think of it is being able to do anything. So there is no thing that an omnipotent being cannot do, is the usual understanding. The trouble with this is, it looks like there are several things that we might want to say that it is impossible to do. And if there are things that it is impossible to do, then obviously nobody could do them, which suggests that nobody could be omnipotent, including, of course, God. One suggestion for a thing that can't be done is to make a square circle. Could God make a square circle? Well, it doesn't look like it, because if he made a square it wouldn't be a circle, and if he made a circle it wouldn't be a square. So you can't make a square circle. It's a contradiction in terms. The definition of square precludes something being a circle and vice versa. If it has four sides it's not a circle, but you have to have four sides to be a square. Okay, so there's something that we can describe, making a square circle, that it looks like nobody could do, not even God. Now, there are two possible responses to this. And this is just an example of a logical contradiction. Can God make a logical contradiction true? Like, can God make 2 + 2 = 5 instead of 4? These are all sort of lumped into the same kind of category of thing. So let's just focus on square circle as an example. There are two reactions to this. One reaction, and this is the typical reaction, this is the reaction that, for example, Aquinas takes, is that no, God couldn't do that. God couldn't make a square circle. Nobody can make a square circle because it's not really a thing. For it to be a thing, for it to be a task that could be accomplished, there has to be a sort of conceivable outcome. You have to be able to conceive of a square circle for it to be genuinely possible, for it genuinely to be a thing that can be done. But given that you can't, and you can't conceive of 2 plus 2 equaling 5 either, these are not really things. So it's wrong to say that this is a thing that God can't do, because it's not even a thing. So there are no things that can't be done by God. There are bogus, pseudo tasks that we can sort of describe in words but don't really mean anything, like a square circle. But no, those can't be done, so God not being able to do them doesn't prove that there's something he can't do. That's the usual response. So it suggests that God can still do anything, where we think of things as genuine tasks that make sense. That's one response. Another response, which is much less popular, but which is defended by René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, and in your readings by Harry Frankfurt, although I'm not sure how seriously he's suggesting this, but he defends it for the sake of argument in that very short piece that you read in your readings. Is that, yes, God can make 2 plus 2 equals 5. Yes, God could make a square circle. Just because we can't imagine it proves that we're limited, but God could do it if he wanted. Because after all, to say otherwise is to suggest that the laws of logic were not invented by God, that they are somehow independent of God. Now, there's some advantage to saying that there are some things that are independent of God. Laws of logic and so on. And it's actually a fairly radical step to say that God could make 2 plus 2 equals 4. God could make up is down and black is white at the same time, if he wanted. Because if that's true, then again it makes God kind of alien to us. It means that God could do anything. It means that things we say about him don't really make sense anymore. So for example, if God is sort of above logic, then we want to say that God loves us. Well, if God is above logic, then it could be true to say that he loves us, and true at the same time that he wants to torture us for fun. Well, those seem contradictory to us. Yes, but God is above logic, and God can do contradictory things. So it's a pretty radical step to say that God is above logic, and certainly one that Aquinas didn't want to take, Aquinas being, considered the greatest Christian philosopher. But on the other hand, it certainly seems to fit with our idea of, it's the highest level of omnipotence. God is not bound by anything, even the rules of logic. Okay, that's the first category of tasks, the logical contradictions. Now, suppose we take Aquinas's answer and say, okay, not being able to do logical contradictions doesn't prove that you're not omnipotent, because logical contradictions don't really count as tasks. So an omnipotent being could still exist who is able to do things that actually count as tasks. Well then, this is where the puzzle that Mavrides in your readings discusses comes in, which is the famous paradox of the stone. It goes like this. Here is a challenge for God. Can God make a stone that is too heavy for him, God, to lift? Now this is a paradox in the sense that it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Because let's say God can do this. Let's say God can make a stone that is too heavy for God to lift. Well, if God can do this, well, he can do it, so that's one thing he can do, but it necessarily implies that there is something that God can't do, which is, of course, lift the stone. Because if God can make a stone that's too heavy for him to lift, then there exists this stone that God cannot lift. So there is something that God cannot do. So if God can make this stone, it proves that God can't do everything. And on the definition that we're working on, therefore God is not omnipotent. Okay, well, what if we say, all right, God can't make the stone? Uh-oh, there's something God can't do, which is make this stone. So once again, God can't be omnipotent, because being omnipotent means being able to do anything. And here's something that God can't do. Now, can we do the same thing that Aquinas did with square circles and say, well, actually, this is a pseudo task. A stone too heavy for God to lift is really a logical contradiction. On the face of it, it doesn't look like it, because, you know, square circle, you can't even conceive of a square circle. If I say, imagine that, picture in your minds a square circle, you can't do it. But can you picture a really, really big stone? Sure you can. And certainly it's easy to picture a stone too heavy for me to lift. It wouldn't be a very big stone at all. So this doesn't seem immediately to be a logical contradiction. But what Mavrides argues in the other short article that is part of your readings is that in fact it really is a logical contradiction. So Aquinas' solution that this is in fact a pseudo task and not being able to do it doesn't prove that you're not omnipotent would apply to this just as much as to the square circle. How does it work? Well, he says, look, really what you're saying, think of what you're talking about, this stone that we're being asked to imagine. It is in fact a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being, because God is supposed to be omnipotent by definition. It is supposed to be a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift. Alright, that's the definition. Well, either that's a contradiction. So let's look at that option. Either that's a contradiction or it isn't. If it is a contradiction, then Aquinas' solution works, because not being able to do contradictions doesn't prove that you're not omnipotent. Why might you think it's a contradiction? Well, what is the definition of omnipotent? Able to do anything. So you're saying this stone is a stone so heavy that a person able to do anything, which includes lift anything, cannot lift. But there is no such stone. By definition, there can't be a stone that can't be lifted by a being capable of lifting anything, because the being can lift anything. So there is no such stone. It's a logical impossibility, like a square circle. Okay, so once again, the same solution works. That's if that definition is contradictory. But Mavrides actually goes on to say, well, let's suppose the description, a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift, is not a contradiction. Well, if it's not a contradiction, then not being able to lift it doesn't prove you're not omnipotent. Why not? Because look at the definition. It's a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift. That means if there can be such a thing, then you can be omnipotent and not be able to lift it. So if God can't lift it, it doesn't prove he's not omnipotent, because even an omnipotent being can't lift this. That's his second, slightly more, I think, satirical response. The main response that people have gotten out of Mavrides is that actually the stone too heavy for God to lift is a disguised contradiction, like a square circle. Alright, the alternative response to the paradox of the stone is offered by Frankfurt. And he says, hey, if God is, remember, he takes Descartes' side and said that God is not bound by the laws of logic, so God can do contradictory things. So if God can do contradictory things, then he can make a stone too heavy to lift, and he can also lift it at the same time. Now that seems like a contradiction. Well, yes, it is a contradiction, but God can do contradictions. No problem. And again, this gives you some idea of how strange it is to suggest that God should be above logic, because it just means that we are incapable of understanding him, because we, believe it or not, cannot think except logically. We have to follow the laws of logic. We can't conceive of things that break the laws of logic. So that's the alternative response. Now, does this mean that we proved that God is omnipotent? Well, it seems like we watered down omnipotent a little. Instead of being able to do anything, omnipotent is now, first of all, able to do anything logically possible. And actually, there's a bunch of other things that appear to be things that God cannot do. And these would be things that you or I could do easily. For example, sin. Can God sin? Well, we want to say that he can, but he just wouldn't. But if you push a little harder and say, well, what does it mean to say that God can do it? It means he has the ability to do it. Well, what would prove that you have the ability to do it? Because anyone can claim they can do things. It's like, you know, it's like when you were a kid in the playground and somebody said, I could kill you with these fingers because I know Kung Fu. And you say, well, prove it. He said, no, I shouldn't do that. I should keep my powers in check. Well, because secretly they were bullshitting and they didn't have any such ability. So it's easy to say that you can do something. There has to be evidence that you can do it. What's the evidence that God can sin? Well, we could imagine a possible scenario where God sins. We would have to be able to imagine a possible scenario where God sins. You know, so for example, I could say I could kill someone with a gun, because you can imagine a possible scenario where I take a gun and I shoot someone. That would never happen, but it could, and you can imagine it. Can you imagine a scenario where God sins? No, because God is perfect, and if God sins, he wouldn't be perfect, and by definition he is perfect, so there cannot be a possible scenario where God, who is perfect, does an imperfect thing, because then he wouldn't be God. So it looks like actually God can't sin, and there's something we're able to do, no problem. So we can do things that God can't do, and these would be actual tangible things, unlike making square circles. So does that mean that God is not all-powerful, or should we just change the definition of all-powerful so it doesn't include things like that? That's where the debate rages. But you're only being asked to look at the puzzle of the stone, really. Okay, let's look now at omniscience, being all-knowing. Now, I'm sorry that now there's some discussion of this in the Stairs and Bernard chapter. What's it called? The Concept of God chapter 1 it's called. It's from a textbook by Stairs and Bernard. And I also gave you a reading by a contemporary philosopher of religion called Linda Zagzebski, who has a lot to say on this. And sadly, going through it again, I see that it might be a bit heavy going because she uses a fair amount of terminology that's pretty philosophical. So I'll try and give you the gist so that I hope that it will make more sense. The puzzle with omniscience. Now she says there's lots of puzzles, and she goes into some of them. But the main one that we're going to focus on is the apparent contradiction between, or at least conflict between, God's foreknowledge, which means knowledge before the fact, and human freedom. So first of all, foreknowledge. Why should God have foreknowledge? Well, it's usually assumed that if God knows everything, this includes things that have not yet happened. So if I were to ask you, decide now whether to raise your hand in 3 seconds. You either will do it or you won't do it. One of the two. Make the decision. Does God know right now which you're going to do, or could you surprise him? Most people, I think, would say God knows, and not just is a really good guesser, but knows, infallibly knows. There is no way that you could do something to surprise him. There's no way that he could say you're going to raise your arm and you don't. If he believes, if he knows you're going to raise your arm, that means that arm's going up. No possible alternative. Okay, well that kind of makes clear the conflict. The conflict is, if God does, in fact, because he's omniscient and because omniscience includes foreknowledge, if God knows what you're going to do before you do it, then it looks like you don't really have an option. You have to do what God knows you will do. You may think right now you have an option. I'm going to raise my hand, you think, but I could not. It's under my control. I don't have to raise my hand. I will, but I could have not done it. Well, according to this puzzle, no, you couldn't. Because God knew you would, so you had to. There's no way you couldn't have. Because if you did, it would have proved God wrong, and you can't do that because God is infallible and has infallible foreknowledge. Well, why is that a problem for human freedom? Well, because the usual understanding of human freedom is you're only free concerning any particular action that you do if you could have done otherwise. So, for example, if I don't know, if a very strong wind catches my arm as we're walking down the street and it blows my arm so it smacks you in the face, I didn't do that freely because I couldn't stop it. Let's say the wind was incredibly strong. So you would say, and freedom is important. Freedom is actually an incredibly important topic in philosophy. You could teach an entire class about freedom because it's connected with responsibility. Whether or not you are responsible for your actions and therefore should be praised or blamed for them depends on whether or not they were done freely. It is usually assumed. So, if the wind blows my hand and it slaps you, you could be mad, but it would be silly to be mad at me because I couldn't help it. It wasn't something I had control over. So, for it to be a free action, I had to have had the possibility to do otherwise. But if God knows what we're going to do before we do it, every single thing we do is something we have to do. And there is no alternative. So nothing we do actually is free, according to this puzzle. So God's foreknowledge takes away all human freedom. Now that's a pretty bad result for all kinds of reasons. A lot of theological reasons. For example, the idea that humans are free is very important in a lot of theology. So, for example, why did God punish Adam and Eve for eating the apple? Usually it's assumed because they did it freely. If they couldn't help it, and if he knew they would do that when he made them, then it's ridiculous to punish them. It's just cruel to punish them. Because after all, God made Adam and Eve. And if God made Adam and Eve and knew, as presumably he would, before he even made them, that they would eat the apple, and made them such that they would eat the apple, then isn't eating the apple really God's fault? And then if he punishes them, and not only punishes them, but punishes all their children, which is, whether or not that's just punishment is another philosophical puzzle. But, pretty major punishment goes down there. That just doesn't seem fair. And if it's not fair, then that implies that God is unfair, and therefore not morally perfect, or perfectly just, which God is supposed to be by definition. So you can see a whole sort of house of cards starts tumbling down if humans don't really have the freedom that they're supposed to have. Now, not every theologian believes that. Calvin, for example, after whom Calvinism is named, believed that we didn't really have free will. We were predestined. We were predetermined to do what we do. But that's a pretty harsh view. And again, it doesn't really paint God in a very nice light. If God makes us like little wind-up toys that we have to do things, and then punishes some of us when the thing that they are made to do is bad, and rewards others when the thing that they are made to do it turns out to be good, when neither of them chose their fate, and in fact God chose it for them, that seems pretty wacky. That seems like a mad scientist at work rather than a just God. Okay, so this is an important puzzle, whether or not in fact God's foreknowledge takes away human freedom. Now, one thing people almost immediately say is, well, wait a minute. God just knows what you're going to do. He doesn't make you do it. That's true, but it doesn't matter. And actually, you could say that's not really true, because after all, who made you? God made you. And if God knew what you would do before he made you, then in effect he did make you do it. He made you such that you would do it. Now, you think you're acting freely, but maybe we can program computers to think that they're acting freely but actually be doing what we program them to do. And wouldn't God have done something like that with us if we have to do exactly one thing and one thing only at any moment? Alright, now there are various proposed responses to this that try to defend both omniscience and human freedom. One view, which is held now by a group of thinkers who are called open theists, is that this is a bit like the Aquinas response to the omnipotence puzzle. It says God knows everything, but God doesn't know what you're going to do next, what genuinely free beings are going to do next. Well, then how can he be omniscient if he doesn't know something? And the answer is because the thing he doesn't know is something that can't be known. So just as you can be omnipotent but not be able to make a square circle because it's not a thing that can be made, you can be omniscient but not know what a free being will do next because it's not a thing that can be known. Now, there's a lot of assumptions that are built into this view. First of all, we have to assume that God is in time with us. So we have to reject the idea that God is outside of time, the Aquinas view, that God is outside of time, divorced from the flow of time. Because if God is outside of time, he can see everything that ever happens immediately. It's like a big four-dimensional block. That in some respects, the future has already happened for God if he's outside of time. So first of all, we have to say, no, God is in the present with us. And then we have to say, if you are genuinely free, then nothing about the past predicts what you will do. What you will do is totally undetermined by everything that came before. And a lot of philosophers have a problem with that. A lot of philosophers would argue that that makes your actions totally random rather than free. But we won't get into that just yet. So if you're prepared to accept that God is in time with us and the actions of a truly free being cannot be predicted even by the entire history of the universe before them, because of course God would know all that, then what they are about to do hasn't been determined and can't be known. Then you have to say, if it can't be known, then it is no blemish on an omniscient being that they can't know it, because it can't be known. That's the open theist view. So it says God is omniscient and humans are free. The downside to this is it makes it possible for us to surprise God. We'll do something and God will say, well, I couldn't have predicted that. Does that seem godly? Not clear. And also, the upshot of this view is that God is taking a huge risk. If God can't predict the future of free beings, then in creating free beings, he's taking a risk that we will basically do the right thing. It seems to threaten what is called the view of providence, that there is a plan for the universe that will play out as God plans it. Well, if he's creating free beings and he doesn't know what we'll do, well, he can't be sure that the plan will come to fruition. Now, you might say this fits with some scripture, because after all, the great flood in the Old Testament is he basically decided everything was going too wrong. The humans were just so awful that they had to be wiped out and we had to start again. So that might fit with this view. And you might, maybe he thought there was a genuine chance that Adam and Eve would not eat the apple. Of course, then there's a question of why put the apple in there anyway. Seems like an obvious temptation, but we don't need to get into that. But again, it presents God as a bit of a gambler, and a gambler who's prepared to destroy his work. So you know, we have this view that, you know, there's a plan for the universe and it'll come out all right. Well, maybe not. Maybe this universe, he'll say, oh, screw it, this one didn't work. Let's make a new one. And junk us all. If, on the other hand, you think, no, this universe is got to develop according to God's plan, God knows what we will do, and we can't surprise God, God knows what we will do before we do it, then open theism is not for you. Is there a possible response that enables God to know what we're going to do next and yet us still be free? Well, there's a couple of responses. One of them, suggested by William of Ockham, is this idea that tries to focus on an argument like this. The argument goes, it is a fact, say, an hour ago, that God knows, that God knew that I would raise my hand now. So, it's a fact. 1 hour ago, God knew that I would raise my hand. And it's either true or it isn't, and God knows that it's true. Well, then it seems like I can't not raise my hand, because then I would make something that was true an hour ago false, and I have no ability to change the past. It was true an hour ago that God knew that I would raise my hand. I can't make that false. Well, Ockham has this idea that there are hard facts and there are soft facts. It is a hard fact that, you know, an hour ago this was a banana. Right? That's a hard fact. That I can't change that. I can't change that fact about the past. But it's a soft fact that God knew that I would raise my hand. Does that mean that God didn't know? No. But it means that the exact content of his knowledge depends on what I do now. So if I raise my hand, it means that God knew an hour ago that I would raise my hand. But if I don't raise my hand, it means that God knew an hour ago that I wouldn't raise my hand. Either way, God infallibly knew. But it's sort of up to me to make what he knew true. I don't know about you, but this sounds totally bogus. And I think Zagzebski agrees that this is a pretty slippery suggestion. And the distinction, as she said, between hard past and soft past is hard to make. It sounds like I can change the past by my free action. And that just doesn't seem right. Either we want to say, I mean, imagine God knew what I would do and then wrote it down on a piece of paper. Can I, if I raise my hand, will I make the piece of paper say he will raise his hand? Whereas if I don't raise my hand, will I make the piece of paper say he won't raise his hand? Do I have that effect? Is it like Schrodinger's cat? That just seems weird. Okay, an alternative response is suggested by a guy called Molina. And this view is called Molinism. Molina was around, I think, in the 1500s. And it is defended by a fair amount of people in philosophy of religion today. And they suggest that this is the doctrine of middle knowledge. So Molina said, God has three kinds of knowledge. God knows necessary truths that are true independently of his creation. So Molina agrees with Aquinas that logic is independent of God's creation. So that's sort of, he knows prior to creation. God also knows what will result from his creation. So God knows what is called contingent truths, things that are in fact true but didn't have to be true. So it's like a contingent truth that, I don't know, I put on a blue shirt today. It's true, it just didn't have to be true. Whereas it's a necessary truth that 2 + 2 = 4. It's true and there's no way it could be false. So God knows necessary truths. God knows contingent truths that are as a result of his creation. But there's also a middle ground of knowledge, middle knowledge. He knows there are certain things that are true before he does anything, and these are called the counterfactuals of freedom. So believe it or not, for any possible, so imagine God before he creates the universe. He could create any kind of universe he wants. There's an infinity of possible universes that he could create. However, he knows that if he were to create a particular free being, say me, that I would freely do a particular thing at a particular time. So he can't make me so that I freely do other than that. In other words, there's sort of a rule book that he can't control, which is what a particular free being would do at any moment. And he has to follow those rules. So if the rule book says, if you create Simon Cushing in this particular time, he will raise his hand freely, then God could make it so that I don't raise my hand, but he can't make it so that I freely don't raise my hand. So God can make me do stuff, but he can't make me freely do something. Because if I am to be free, then my freedom will be such that I do this one thing. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff written about this. Again, I don't find it very plausible, but the basic idea is that free beings, there is something that they will freely do. And God knows that before he even creates us. So, it means that God has a certain amount of control, because he says, he knows, well, if I make this particular free being in this particular circumstance, I know that they'll sin. I don't want to do that. So I can't make that free being. I can make another free being because I know that this free being, if I look it up in the rule book, oh, this person will do the right thing. Okay, so I'll make that one, and they will freely do it. So, what he wants to say is that they're free. These people are free. I'm free. Why? Because God didn't make me do what I do. What does? I just do what I do. God happens to know what I will do before he makes me, but I'm not doing it because of him. I'm doing it because of, well, because of what? That's the weird thing about this view. What is this rule book? What settles the counterfactuals of freedom? What settles that a free being X will do action Y in circumstance Z? I can get that the rules of logic are external to God, but I don't get how something like these counterfactuals of freedom can be external to God. And it is a puzzle. Again, there are a fair number of modern philosophers who defend this view. There's a guy called Alvin Plantinga, who we'll come across later. There's a guy called Thomas Flint. And they for some reason they all seem to be at Notre Dame. They're all philosophers of religion at Notre Dame. That's where Molinism is hot right now. But it's an attempt to preserve the idea that we're free, and at the same time God can know what we're going to do. How does God know what we're going to do? Because he has access to the sort of invisible book of counterfacts. So notice, it means he knows what everybody he does create will do, but he also knows what everybody he could have created will do. So if I were to ask God, well, supposing you had made a person like this who is alive now. You didn't, but supposing you did, what would they do? And he could know what they would do if he had made them. So he knows he doesn't just know what actual people and what actual free beings will do. He knows what possible beings would have done if he'd made them. So that's a lot of knowledge. But is it omniscience? And well, yes, says this view. So this view gives God more knowledge than the open theism view. God knows what we're going to do next, whereas on the open theism view, God doesn't know what we're going to do next. But then I want to know why, again, it seems a little bit like my freedom is restricted. Can I do other than what the counterfactuals of freedom say I can do? No. According to the book of counterfactuals of freedom, I raise my hand. Can I do otherwise? No. Well, then in what sense am I free? It sounds like we're back to the problem of I don't have genuine options. There is one and only one thing I have to do. Now, supposedly I do that freely. Because why? Because it's not determined by God, but it's still only one thing. And it's a fact of the matter that I have to do that. That doesn't sound like freedom. That's the Molinist response. Okay. So, two important puzzles that we're focusing on. The puzzle of the stone from Omnipotence, and the puzzle of whether or not freedom and God's foreknowledge. That's a puzzle from omniscience, because it looks like foreknowledge is covered by omniscience. Now there's a few other puzzles, like I said, like, you know, can God sin is a puzzle for omnipotence, and can God know what it's like to die? Presumably not, because God can't die. Does that mean there's something that we can describe what it's like to die that God can't know? Now, of course, Christians say, well, Jesus died and Jesus was God, but there's all kinds of philosophical puzzles with that, and the Muslim scholar is not going to agree with that, because according to Muslims, Christians are polytheists because they split God into 3 parts, and that is shirk. It is not Tawheed. Tawheed, if you remember from your reading of the book on Islam, is this idea of the unicity of God. God is indivisible. So Muslims think that Christians are polytheists without knowing it. They believe in more than one God. And actually, Mormons seem to argue that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are 3 different beings, so they might actually be polytheists. But most mainstream Christians like to say that no, God in 3 persons, but is also indivisible. Well, then let's talk about God who's indivisible. Can God die? Can God know what it is to cease to live? Presumably not. So again, that seems to be a threat to knowing everything. Alright, interesting philosophical issues. I hope you'll agree. That'll do it for this week.